Good morning, boys and girls. I'm Eleanor Hawkins, and welcome to Telestory Time. I want to read one of my favorite poems, The Library, a Magic Castle. Come to the magic castle when you are growing tall. Rows upon rows of word windows line every single wall. They reach up high as the sky, and you want to open them all. For every time you open one, a new adventure has begun. The library, a magic castle. And now it's time for our very first story. And the one I've chosen for this morning is entitled, To Market, to Market. One cold, nippy day, Mrs. Goose came out of her house to go to market. She slammed the door and it locked tight. Then she found out that she couldn't move. "Oh, something has caught me," she said. "Here I am, held fast. What shall I do?" She set down her market basket. She wriggled and turned this way and that. Then she noticed why she couldn't get free. Her coat was caught in the door. "Now I know what I will do," she laughed. "I'll just slip out of my coat. That will fix it." So she slipped out of her coat and left it hanging in the door. She took up her market basket and went along. But soon she began to feel cold. "Oh, what shall I do about that?" she asked herself. I know, I'll go back and get into my coat again. It is better to be warm and comfortable and stay in one place than cold and shivery and walk in a lot of places." It was hard to wiggle into her coat, but Mrs. Goose managed to do it. And there she was, held tight again. Mrs. Hen came by. "Well, now what are you doing?" she asked Mrs. Goose. "If you must know, I caught my coat in the door," answered Mrs. Goose. "I can't move with it on, and I'm cold with it off, so I just have to stay here." Mrs. Hen looked Mrs. Goose all over, up and down, and then she asked, "Well, why don't you open the door?" "Because it's locked," Mrs. Goose said. "You don't suppose I'd be standing here if it was unlocked, do you?" "Well, now you might," thought Mrs. Hen. But out loud she said, "Is there any reason why you can't unlock the door?" Mrs. Goose looked bright. "Well, no," she said. "I guess there isn't. I have the key right here. Oh, how fortunate." She turned the key in the lock and the door came open. Mrs. Hen asked her, "Now, what are you going to do now?" "Oh, go to market just as I'd planned. That's where I was going when all of this happened." "Well, now we can go together then," Mrs. Hen said. "That's where I was going too." And they walked along side by side. But soon Mrs. Goose stopped and said, "It seems to me that I have forgotten something I ought to remember." "Have you got your grocery list?" asked Mrs. Hen. Mrs. Goose rummaged in her handbag. "Oh, yes, here it is." "Well, now, have you got your money?" She rummaged again. "No, I haven't." "Well, now, that was what I was trying to remember. I knew there was something." "Well, run back and get your money then," sighed Mrs. Hen. "I'll wait for you here." Mrs. Goose hurried back. Mrs. Hen waited and waited and waited. She knew that Mrs. Goose had plenty of time to go and come back. At last she started toward the house. And there was Mrs. Goose standing caught in the door again. "Twice in one day, that's pretty bad," Mrs. Hen told her. "But I hope you remember how you got free before. Why haven't you unlocked the door?" "Well, now, I got my money," Mrs. Goose said, looking cross, "but I must have left my key on the table. You don't suppose I'd be standing here if I had the key, do you?" "Well, now you might," thought Mrs. Hen. Then she asked, "Why don't you get out of your coat the way you did before, and then try to see if you can get into your house some other way? Maybe a window is open or something." Mrs. Goose looked at her as if she had said something very foolish. I told you I am cold without my coat. Mrs. Hen said slowly, well, now, wouldn't it be better to be cold and sensible for a few minutes than warm and foolish for a long time? Mrs. Goose just shut her eyes and murmured, I'd rather be warm. And foolish, added Mrs. Hen. That goes with it. But if you want to be a bigger goose than you are already, stay there, and I'll go around the house to see if I can get in. She went around the corner of the house. The back door leading to the kitchen was wide open. She went in, got the key from the table, and soon Mrs. Goose and her coat were free. Well, now, how did you get in the house? Mrs. Goose asked. Well, your back door was wide open, replied Mrs. Hen. Oh, yes, I must have left it open when I swept the biscuits out, exclaimed Mrs. Goose. And what do you mean by that? I was so busy getting ready to go to market that I burned them. They were so hot that I dropped them on the floor, and the biscuits broke into lots of little black pieces. Then I had to open the door to sweep them out. But I hope it hasn't made my house all cold. Mrs. Goose rushed into the kitchen and called, Oh, yes, it is cold in here, and I'm in. Well, now, I thought you wanted to be out, Mrs. Hen said. You were going to market when all this happened. Mrs. Goose sat down in her red rocking chair and shut her eyes. That's so. But what a time I've had. Oh, I just feel awful. Quickly, Mrs. Hen took her by the wing. If you don't feel well, market is no place for you, she said. Come and lie down on your bed. She led Mrs. Goose to the bedroom. She set the market basket beside her and covered her with a blanket. Goodbye now, she said, and she rushed away. Now, when she had gone just a little way, she sat down to get her breath. Along came Mr. and Mrs. Pop Rabbit with their 3 little bunnies. Well, why are you sitting here? They asked her. Oh, because I'm tired. Mrs. Goose and I. But Mrs. Hen didn't finish what she started to say. She suddenly jumped up and began running as fast as she could. She can't be very tired, Mrs. Pop Rabbit said, to run like that. But Mrs. Hen had just remembered that she had forgotten to turn off her oven, and by now her biscuits would be burned too. Oh, I'll never tell Mrs. Goose about this, thought Mrs. Hen as she hurried home. And that, boys and girls, is the story. To market, to market. And now stay tuned while I will be reading our Big Do You Know book in just a moment. And now, boys and girls, I'm going to read from our Big Do You Know book. Do you know all about our calendar? Do you know calendars divide time into units such as days, weeks, months, and years? Do you know calendar divisions are based on movements of the Earth on the Sun and the Moon? Do you know a day is the average time it takes for one rotation of the Earth on its axis? Yes, 24 hours a day. Do you know a year is the average time it takes for our one rotation of the Earth around the Sun? Yes, that's 365 days a year. Do you know the Julian calendar was established in 45 BC by Julius Caesar? This calendar fixed the normal year 365 days. Do you know the Julian calendar established the months of the year and the days of the week? Do you know in 1582 the Julian calendar was revised by Pope Gregory because the Julian calendar was 11 minutes and 14 seconds longer than the solar year. He shortened the calendar year slightly to match the solar year. This new calendar, called the Gregorian calendar, is the one we use today. Now you know all about our calendar. And boys and girls, be sure and mark your calendar to remind you to go to your public library. Any of the libraries in the Craven, Pamlico, Carteret Regional Library System. And there you can mark the date for your story hour and to be sure and check out some books on your very own library card. And now stay tuned and we'll be back with another story in just a moment. And now, boys and girls, I'm going to read you the story, The 5 Jolly Brothers. Johnny had 5 jolly brothers and 1 cat. There was Johnny's brother Paul, who was a policeman. Paul had red hair and he was very strong. He could lift heavy weights. There was Johnny's brother Fred, who was a fireman. Fred was short and fat. He could stand on his head. There was Johnny's brother Tom, who was a tugboat captain. Tom had bushy eyebrows and a beard. He could walk the tightrope. There was Johnny's brother Peter, who was an airplane pilot. Peter had waves in his hair. He could play the piccolo. There was Johnny's brother Roy, who was a railroad engineer. Roy had a big nose and big ears. He was a high jumper. And there was Johnny's cat, whose name was Scattergood. Scattergood was a calico cat with spots of many colors. But all Scattergood could do was to get himself into mischief. He couldn't even catch mice. Johnny and his 5 brothers all slept in one big bedroom. There were 5 big beds for the 5 jolly brothers. There was one middle-sized bed for Johnny, and there was a basket where Scattergood slept. Every day when Johnny's brothers came home from work, they took off their uniforms and hung them up neatly in a row above the bedroom wall. Then they put on dungarees and red shirts and went downstairs for supper. One evening, Johnny was busy watching his brother Paul lifting weights, his brother Fred standing on his head, his brother Tom walking the tightrope, his brother Peter playing the piccolo, and his brother Roy jumping. Now, while this was going on, Scattergood was upstairs getting into mischief. He was knocking the brothers' hats off their hooks on the bedroom wall. Soon all 5 hats were on the floor. When Johnny went up to bed, he saw what had happened, so he hung the hats up again. But he was so sleepy that he hung them all on the wrong hooks. The next morning, Johnny's 5 brothers got up before daylight to start for work. They didn't turn on the light because Johnny was still asleep. One after the other, the 5 brothers put on their uniforms in the dark and reached for their hats hanging on the hooks. Scattergood strolled across the room just as Johnny's brother Roy was starting to leave for work. When Roy put his foot down, he stepped on Scattergood's tail. Poor Scattergood, he dashed across the room with a terrific yell and jumped on Johnny's bed. Johnny sat up in bed and snapped on the light. "Well, what happened?" he asked. "Oh, I'm sorry we woke you up, Johnny," said Roy. "I stepped on Scattergood's tail by accident, but he's all right." Johnny rubbed his eyes. "But you all look so funny," he said. "Why are you wearing one another's hats?" The 5 jolly brothers looked at each other for the first time that morning, and then they burst out laughing, and it was no wonder. Paul the policeman was wearing the engineer's cap. Fred the fireman was wearing the pilot's cap. Tom the tugboat captain was wearing the policeman's hat. Peter the pilot was wearing the fireman's hat. And Roy the engineer was wearing the tugboat captain's hat. Oh, it was such a good joke. They couldn't stop laughing. It was quite a while before they got their hats unscrambled and started off to work. "Goodbye, Johnny," they called. "Don't forget to give that lazy Scattergood his milk, even if he can't catch mice." That night, Johnny and Scattergood walked to the bus stop on the corner to wait for Johnny's 5 jolly brothers to come home from work. "Hi, Johnny. How is your lazy cat Scattergood?" Paul the policeman asked as soon as the 5 jolly brothers got off the bus. "Oh, he's a good cat," Johnny said. "Ho, ho," laughed Paul the policeman. "He can't even catch a mouse." They all went laughing down the street, and Johnny never noticed that each of his 5 brothers was carrying a big box. When supper time came, Johnny found the 5 boxes piled up by his chair. "Surprise!" the 5 jolly brothers cried. "Thank you for saving us from wearing the wrong hats this morning." Johnny opened each of the 5 boxes and pulled out a policeman's hat, a fireman's hat, a tugboat captain's hat, an airplane pilot's cap, and a railroad engineer's cap. "Oh, it's the best surprise I ever had," cried Johnny. Thank you all very much for these presents." Then Johnny saw Scattergood sitting in the doorway. Scattergood should have a surprise too," said Johnny. "What could we give him?" "Ho, ho," laughed Paul the policeman. "He shall have a ferocious rubber mouse because he can't catch himself a real one." And that, boys and girls, is the story of the 5 jolly brothers. And now stay tuned, and we'll be back with another story in just a moment. And now, boys and girls, I'm going to read you the story, Rip Van Winkle. In a village near the Catskill Mountains, Rip Van Winkle led a carefree life in a tumble-down old house with his children and his wife. On a bench beside the village inn, through a long summer's day, Rip and his friends would sit and talk the hours away. Rip was a special friend of the village girls and boys. He flew their kites and played their games and mended all their toys. "While you mend toys," cried his wife in rage, "the roof on our house is leaking." But Rip and his dog took to the woods while his angry spouse was speaking. As the mountains cast their shadows and the sun sank low in the sky, Rip beheld a man with a keg climbing the path nearby. Rip hastened to offer assistance, and much to his surprise, he found a dwarf-like fellow with flowing beard and beady eyes. Not a word had the stranger spoken as they climbed to the mountain top. Sounds of thunder rumbled and rolled. The little man motioned Rip to stop. The peals of thunder grew closer, rumbling, rumbling, rolling. Rip saw through the trees an open spot where more little men were bowling. They were dressed like his companion. There must have been 8 or 10. They stared at Rip in silence. They turned their game again. The ball made a noisy rumble as it rolled along the ground. Then it knocked the 9 pins down with a crashing, thunderous sound. Rip grew weary of watching this odd company at play. He sat down to rest, but alas, he fell sound asleep right away. The birds were singing when Rip woke up, and the sun was shining bright. What excuse shall I give my wife for sleeping here all night? He didn't know that he was old, with a beard that was long and white, or that he had slept for 20 years instead of just one night. He whistled and called for his dog, but Wolf was nowhere about. All he could hear were the echoes returning his whistle and his shout. My pages are stuck together. So Rip picked up his rusty gun, and hungry now for food, he hobbled slowly home again in a sad and troubled mood. When he reached the village, people stopped to stare, for Rip was a sight to behold with his raggedy clothes and long white hair. "Does nobody know Rip Van Winkle?" he asked. His eyes were filled with tears. "Rip Van Winkle," said 2 or 3, "has been gone for 20 years. "It is Rip Van Winkle," said an old woman as she tottered to his side. "Where have you been these 20 years? And here are your children," she cried. On a bench beside the village inn, as in the days long past, Rip would tell his story to strangers when they asked. Now to this day, when the village children hear the thunder rumbling and rolling, they say that the little man up there are up in the mountains still bowling. And that is the story of Rip Van Winkle. And now I see I have time enough to read you an Aesop fable that I have in this collection. And the one I want to read is entitled The Hare and the Tortoise. A hare was making fun of the tortoise one day for being so slow. "Do you ever get anywhere?" he asked with a mocking lie. "Oh yes," replied the tortoise, "and I get there sooner than you think. I'll run you a race and prove it." The hare was much amused at the idea of running a race with the tortoise, but for the fun of the thing, he agreed. So the fox, who had consented to act as a judge, marked the distance and started the runners off. The hare was soon far out of sight, and to make the tortoise feel feel very deeply how ridiculous it was for him to try a race with a hare, he lay down beside the course to take a nap until the tortoise could catch up. Now the tortoise meanwhile kept going slowly but steadily, and after a time passed the place where the hare was sleeping. But the hare slept on very peacefully, and when at last he did wake up, the tortoise was near the goal. The hare now ran his swiftest, but you know he could not overtake the tortoise in time. And actually, the moral of this story is, the race is not always to the swift. And I read this from this book, Aesop Fables. And now, boys and girls, I see it's time for us to close our book of stories for this morning, but we'll be back next Saturday morning. Until then, this is Eleanor Hawkins saying bye-bye for Telestory Time.